I heard
You
the
don't have
metal
the
teeth
authority to
before I
do
saw
this.
them. That slow grinding bite of a
We
backhoe
follow
cutting
the
into soil
covenants.
that didn't belong
This
to them.
stops
And
now.
by the time I stepped onto my back porch barefoot with the morning air still cold against my skin, they were already 10 feet inside my property line, tearing up ground my father had walked for
Keep
40
it
years
clean,
like it
Pine
was just
Creek.
another empty lot on
My
a
legacy
developer's
depends
map.
on it.
And standing there with a clipboard, and that same
I
tight
told you
smile
this
I'd
path
seen at
violates my
every
property
HOA
line.
meeting was
The
Margaret.
survey says otherwise,
Whitmore,
Mr.
watching it
Davies.
all like she was
Readings are
overseeing a
complete. It's on your
routine
land.
landscaping job
Okay, let's
instead of an
see.
invasion.
Comparing the
And the
survey
smell
data
hit me
with the
next,
coordinates.
fresh dirt
Plot
mixed
A,
with diesel
section 7.
fumes, sharp and
There, it's a
raw.
perfect
Like
match.
something sacred being rewritten without permission.
This is
And
the
when I
official
asked her
notice,
what the
Mr.
hell she
Henderson.
thought she was doing, she
I
didn't
believe you
raise
are
her
right.
voice, didn't
I am
flinch,
sorry.
just held up a laminated sheet like it was gospel, and said, "This section is designated as community access according to the updated property map," and that word map hung in the air heavier than the machine noise, heavier than the engine rumble, because I'd never seen any updated map, never signed anything, never agreed to give up even an inch of this land. Not the stretch behind the old oak tree where I used to run as a kid, not the strip along the fence line where my dad taught me how to measure slope with nothing but a level and instinct. And yet here they were, measuring it like it belonged to them, marking it with neon stakes that looked like they'd been planted overnight. And I could feel that familiar pressure building behind my ribs. Not panic, not even anger yet, just the slow realization that this wasn't a mistake. This was planned, executed, signed off somewhere by people who assumed I wouldn't fight back, or worse, couldn't. And Margaret kept talking, explaining zoning adjustments and community improvements in that polished tone, like she was reading from a brochure. But all I could hear was the crunch of gravel under the machine's tracks and the hollow thud of dirt being displaced, like pieces of my history being boxed up and shipped off. And when I stepped closer, close enough to see the fine print on that so-called official map, I noticed something that didn't sit right. Not yet something I could prove, just a detail that fell off, like a word spelled wrong in a legal document. But before I could even process it, one of the workers asked her where to extend the trench next, and she pointed straight past the line I knew by heart, the one my father had walked with me every summer evening, and said, "Take it another 20 feet, all the way to the marker." And that's when I realized they weren't just testing boundaries, they were redrawing them, right in front of me, in daylight, with paperwork in hand. And what they didn't know, what Margaret Whitmore definitely didn't know, was that I had spent 15 years as a civil engineer reading land surveys the way most people read street signs. And something about her precious map was already starting to unravel in my mind, even before I'd taken my first real step to stop them. I did not yell, and I did not step in front of the machine because I knew better than to fight noise with noise. Instead, I walked back inside with the hum of that engine still vibrating through the floorboards and pulled open the drawer where my father used to keep everything that mattered, the smell of old paper and dust rising as I flipped past yellowed envelopes and worn folders until my fingers found the one thing I had not looked at in years, the original survey packet, thick, heavy, precise, the kind of document that does not guess but defines. And I carried it back out to the porch with the same steady pace I used on job sites when something fell off, but not yet broken. And out there the machine kept moving, chewing another strip of dirt, while Margaret stood planted in her pressed clothes like she belonged to the land more than I did. And I opened the survey on the railing, flattening the creases with my palm, tracing the lines I knew by memory, bearings, distances, fixed, points that had not moved in decades. And that is when the difference snapped into focus. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle shift, a few feet here, a few feet there, but enough to turn private land into something they could label as shared. And I looked up at the stakes they had driven into the ground, bright plastic, caps catching the sun, and realized they were not anchored to any permanent marker, no iron pin, no concrete monument, nothing that would hold up under real scrutiny, just temporary flags placed where their version of the map said the line should be. And that was the moment the anger settled into something colder and far more useful, because this was not a misunderstanding and it was not a clerical error. This was a redraw, a quiet shift of boundaries designed to look official to anyone who did not know how to read between the lines. And Margaret saw me watching, saw the change in my expression, and walked over with that same controlled smile, asking if I had found what I needed, and I told her I had, because I finally understood what she was holding in her hand was not proof. It was a version, and versions can be challenged, and she tilted her head slightly like she had heard that line before from someone who lost. Then reminded me that the county had already approved the updated map, that permits were filed, that everything was legal, and the way she said legal told me everything I needed to know about how far this had already gone, and I nodded like I was considering it, like I might step aside and let them finish, but inside I was already rebuilding the entire situation piece by piece, thinking about survey control points, thinking about filing dates, thinking about who signs off on revisions and how those revisions get validated, because maps do not just change on their own. Someone moves them, someone approves them, and someone hopes nobody looks too closely. And as the machine carved another clean line through soil that had been untouched for years, I folded my father's survey back up carefully, not rushed, not shaken, just deliberate, because whatever game they thought they were playing, they had just made one mistake. They assumed the man standing on this porch did not know exactly how to read the ground beneath his own feet. I waited until the machine shut down for lunch before I made my next move, because there is a moment on every job site when the noise dies and the truth has room to breathe. And as the engine ticked and cooled under the noon sun, I walked straight past the half-cut trench and out toward the far edge of my property where the old fence used to meet a rusted steel post that most people would miss if they did not know what they were looking for. The grass brushing against my jeans, dry and brittle from the summer heat. The air carrying that faint metallic scent that always lingers near exposed soil. And I dropped to one knee and started clearing away dirt with my hands, slow and careful, feeling for something solid beneath the loose top layer, because survey markers are not guesses, they are anchors, and if my father's map was right, there should have been a driven iron pin right here set decades ago, something that does not move just because someone redraws a line on paper, and after a minute my fingers hit it, cold, smooth, unmistakable, buried but not gone, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, brushing the rest of the dirt away until the top of that marker caught the sunlight, and I looked back toward the bright plastic stake. Margaret's crew had planted 20 feet away, standing there like it belonged, and that was the difference in one glance, one rooted in steel and time, the other in convenience and ink, and I pulled out my phone, took photos, measured the distance using the same method I had used on hundreds of projects, pacing it out, confirming bearings against the original survey, and every step told the same story. Their line was shifted, not by accident, but just enough to capture the strip they wanted, and when I walked back toward the house, Margaret was already watching me again, her posture tighter now, like she could sense something had changed even if she did not know exactly what, and she asked me if I was finished inspecting, her voice still calm, but with an edge that had not been there before, and I told her I had just started, and that word started seemed to land differently, because she glanced at the crew, then back at me, and reminded me again that everything had been approved, that the county signed off, that I should direct any concerns through proper channels, and I almost smiled at that, because proper channels is where people like her feel safe, buried under paperwork and timelines, assuming the other side will get tired or lost. But I have spent my entire career inside those channels, reading what most people skip, checking what most people assume is correct, and as the workers restarted the machine and the engine roared back to life, I stepped aside, not to surrender the ground, but to give them just enough space to keep digging, because the deeper they went following that wrong line, the clearer the evidence would become. And as I stood there listening to the metal bite into earth again, I realized this was no longer about stopping them today. It was about letting them prove, inch by inch, exactly how wrong their map really was. By late afternoon, the trench stretched nearly 40 yards across what used to be a clean, uninterrupted line of grass, and the sound had changed from sharp cutting to a deeper, heavier grind as they started setting forms for what looked like a permanent pathway, the kind that does not just mark a boundary, but rewrites it. And I stood there with my arms crossed, feeling the low vibration of compactors pressing soil into place while the smell of fresh concrete mix drifted through the air, thick and chalky, settling on everything like a quiet claim of ownership, and Margaret moved through it all with that same controlled efficiency, clipboard in hand, speaking in short, confident instructions to contractors who did not ask questions because they had paperwork that told them not to. And at one point she walked past me close enough that I could catch the faint scent of her perfume cutting through the dust, and she said, almost casually, that once the path was finished it would increase property values for everyone. Like she was offering me a favor instead of taking something that had been in my family longer than she had lived in this county. And I let her talk because every word she said, every decision she made, was building a record she did not realize I was already keeping. And that night I sat at my kitchen table with the overhead light humming softly, the original survey spread out beside my laptop, cross-referencing county filings, pulling up digital records, tracking the exact moment that so-called updated map had been submitted. And it did not take long to find the gap. The submission date was recent, too recent for the level of work already underway, which meant approvals had either been rushed or assumed. And when I dug deeper into the metadata of the filing, I noticed something even more telling. The coordinates listed in the document did not tie back to any registered control point in the county system, which is like building a house without a foundation and expecting it to pass inspection. And I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet tick of the clock on the wall, realizing that what they had built their entire claim on was not just wrong, it was incomplete, and incomplete documents can be challenged, reversed, invalidated. And the next morning I drove into town with the windows down, the dry air rushing in, carrying that same faint scent of disturbed earth that still clung to my clothes, and walked into the county records office where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of paper and toner. And I requested every filing related to my parcel for the last 5 years. Watching the clerk's expression shift slightly when she saw the address, like she recognized it from somewhere. And as she handed over the stack, I could already feel the pieces lining up in my head, because this was no longer just about where the line was drawn. It was about how it got moved in the first place. And as I stepped back outside into the sunlight with those documents in my hands, I looked down the road toward my property, knowing they were probably already back at work, pouring, leveling, setting something permanent into place. And for the first time since that machine crossed my line, I felt completely steady, because they thought permanence came from concrete. But I knew it came from proof, and they had just given me more of it than they ever intended. By the time I got back to the property that afternoon, the transformation was no longer subtle. The trench had been lined, leveled, and partially filled with a base layer that turned raw soil into something structured, something intentional, and the sound of metal rakes scraping across gravel, mixed with the steady hum of a compactor pressing everything into place, made it clear they were not slowing down for anyone. And Margaret was right there again, standing at the edge of it all like she was supervising a project. She had already won, her posture relaxed, her confidence louder than any machine on site. And when she saw me walking toward her with a folder under my arm, she gave me that same practiced smile and asked if I had come to file another complaint, like she already knew how that story would end. And I told her I had been to the county office, that I had reviewed every document tied to this land. And for the first time her expression shifted, not much, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind of reaction you only catch if you are looking for it. And she responded quickly, reminding me again that everything had been approved, that the map was official, that the project was within compliance, repeating those words like they were a shield. But I could hear the edge now, the faint strain underneath the certainty, and I asked her a simple question, one she did not expect. I asked her which control point the updated map was tied to, and for a second there was silence between us, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to know she did not have that answer ready. And she recovered fast, deflecting with something about licensed surveyors and county validation, but she did not say a number, did not name a marker, did not reference a fixed point. And that was all I needed, because maps without control points are not maps. They are sketches dressed up as authority. And as the workers continued spreading gravel behind her, building something that looked more permanent with every pass, I realized they were committing to that error in real time, locking it into the ground inch by inch. And I told her I would be filing a formal challenge, that I would be requesting a verification of the survey basis, and that I would be asking the county to identify the original control reference used for this so-called update. And she smiled again, but it did not reach her eyes this time. And she said I was free to pursue whatever channels I felt necessary, that the project would continue as scheduled, and that I should prepare for the possibility that I was simply mistaken about my own boundaries, and that line might have worked on someone else, someone who did not spend years reading the ground like a blueprint. But as I stood there watching them compact another section into place, I felt something settle into certainty, because the more they built, the more they relied on that flawed map, and the harder it would hit when it broke. And when I turned to walk back toward the house, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounded different now, sharper, more deliberate, like every step was part of something already in motion. Because this was no longer about stopping construction, it was about letting them finish just enough to prove exactly how far they had gone in the wrong direction. The next morning started quieter, almost deceptively calm, with a thin layer of fog still hanging low over the ground and muting the edges of everything. And for a moment, if you ignored the fresh gravel and the sharp straight cut through what used to be uneven grass, it almost looked like nothing had changed, but I could still smell the concrete curing in the cool air, that dry mineral scent that lingers long after the work crews leave. And I stepped out with a measuring tape in one hand and a steel probe rod in the other, tools I had not needed on my own property in years, but tools that suddenly mattered again. And I walked the line slowly, stopping at each visible stake they had placed, checking distances, marking deviations, documenting everything with photos and notes like I was back on a professional site, where every inch had to be justified. And what stood out was not just the shift itself, but the consistency of it. Every marker aligned perfectly with their version of the map, not with reality, which meant this was not a one-time error, but a fully executed redraw. And as I reached the old iron pin I had uncovered the day before, I drove the probe rod into the ground beside it, feeling the resistance of compacted soil give way just enough to confirm depth and placement. And I measured again, cross-checking against the bearings from the original survey, and the numbers held, solid, unchanged, anchored in something that had not moved in decades. And that is when the full picture finally locked into place in my head, because it was not just that their map was wrong, it was that it had never been properly tied to the original survey framework at all. No verified baseline, no confirmed control reference, just a digital overlay placed on top of an assumption. And I stood there for a long second, the quiet broken only by a distant truck passing on the road, realizing that everything they had built so far rested on that single flaw. And once that flaw was exposed, the rest would not just weaken, it would collapse under its own weight. And later that morning I made the call, not to a lawyer yet, not to anyone who would slow things down with process, but to a licensed surveyor I trusted, someone who had spent as many years in the field as I had, someone who understood that lines on paper mean nothing unless they are tied to something real. And when I explained what I had found, there was a pause on the other end, then a low, knowing exhale, and he told me he would come out himself. No assistance, no shortcuts, just a full verification from the original control points. And as I hung up the phone, I looked back toward the newly laid path cutting across my land, clean, straight, confident, and I almost admired the precision of it, because it looked right to anyone who did not know better. But that was the problem, it only looked right. And as the sun burned off the last of the morning fog and the edges of everything sharpened into focus, I realized that what they had built was not just a path, it was evidence, and they had placed it exactly where I needed it to be. He showed up just after noon in a dusty pickup with a tripod strapped in the back and a case that looked like it had seen more field time than most people spend in offices. And when he stepped out, he did not waste time with small talk, just nodded once and took in the scene, the straight line of fresh gravel, the misplaced stakes, the way the new path cut across the land like it had always belonged there. And I could tell from the way his eyes moved that he already understood something was off. Not from anything I said, but from what the ground was telling him. And the air was warmer now, the sun high enough to burn off any softness, leaving everything sharp and exposed, every detail harder to ignore. And he set up his tripod near the old iron marker I had uncovered, leveling it with small, precise adjustments until it stood perfectly still, then mounted his instrument with the kind of care that comes from doing the same motion thousands of times. And when he looked through it for the first reading, everything around us seemed to quiet down, even the distant hum of traffic fading into the background. And I watched as he took measurements, cross-checking angles, calling out numbers under his breath, each one confirming what I had already started to piece together. And then he moved, step by step, following the original survey path, not the one marked by plastic stakes, but the one buried in the land itself. And every time he stopped to measure, he would glance back toward the newly built path, and each glance lasted a little longer than the last, like the gap between what was built and what was real was becoming impossible to ignore, and after nearly an hour of working in silence, he finally lowered the instrument and looked at me with a steady expression that did not need much explanation, but he gave it anyway, slow and clear, saying that the line they were building on was not tied to any valid control point, that it drifted from the original boundary by several feet across the entire stretch, and that no licensed survey should have passed review with that kind of deviation, and hearing it out loud did not bring relief the way I thought it might. It brought something sharper, something more focused, because now it was not just my observation, it was professional confirmation, something that could stand up in a room where opinions do not matter and only proof does. And I asked him to document everything, every measurement, every coordinate, every discrepancy, and he nodded, already setting up for a second pass, more detailed, more deliberate, capturing data that would not just show the error but define it, lock it into numbers that could not be argued away. And as he worked, I could see Margaret in the distance near the far end of the path, talking with one of the contractors, her posture still confident, but her attention drifting more often in our direction now, like she could feel the shift even if she did not yet understand it. And the afternoon light stretched the shadows longer across the ground, laying them over both the original line and the one they had built, two paths crossing the same space, but telling completely different stories. And as I stood there watching the measurements come together, I realized that everything had changed in a single day, not because the ground moved, but because we had finally proven where it never did. The report came back the next morning just after 8, delivered as a clean digital file with pages of measurements, coordinates, and annotated overlays that turned what we had seen in the field into something undeniable. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me as I scrolled through it, each page tightening the case, each diagram showing the same thing from a different angle. The original boundary line fixed and consistent, the new construction drifting off it, like a shadow that did not match its source. And there was a section near the end that mattered more than anything else, a comparison overlay, where both maps were stacked together, and the difference was no longer subtle. It was clear, measurable, and impossible to explain away, a full lateral shift that ran the entire length of the path they had built. And I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, realizing that this was the moment everything changed, because now it was not just a disagreement. It was a documented error, and documented errors have consequences. And by mid-morning I was back at the property, the sun already high, the air warmer, carrying that now familiar mix of dust and curing concrete. And the crew was finishing the last section of the path, smoothing the surface, locking in what they thought was a finished project, and Margaret was there again, standing at the center of it all, talking to someone on her phone with that same calm authority. And when she saw me walking toward her with the report in hand, she ended the call and turned to face me, her expression steady but watchful, and I handed her a printed copy without a word, letting the paper speak for itself. And she took it, glanced at the first page, then the second, her eyes moving faster than before, scanning for something that would confirm her position. But it was not there, and for the first time since this started, the silence between us felt different, heavier, like the ground beneath it had shifted, and she asked where I got it, her voice still controlled but tighter now, and I told her it came from a licensed survey verification tied to the original control points, the ones her map failed to reference. And she tried to push back, saying that the county had already approved their version, that their documentation was valid. But even as she spoke, her grip on the paper tightened slightly, and I pointed to the overlay, to the section where the deviation was highlighted in clear, precise numbers, and I told her this was not about approval anymore. This was about accuracy, and accuracy does not change because someone signs a form. And around us the workers had started to slow down, their movements less certain, their attention drifting toward the conversation, sensing something had shifted even if they did not know the details. And Margaret looked back at the path, then at the report again, and for a brief second the confidence slipped, just enough to show that she understood what this meant, not just for the line they had drawn, but for everything built on it. And as I stood there holding my ground, I realized the noise that had filled this place for days was gone, replaced by something quieter but far more powerful, the weight of proof settling into place. And unlike concrete, this was something she could not reshape once it set. The official notice went up 3 days later, bright orange against the clean gray surface of the path they had just finished. And the sound this time was not machines or engines, but paper snapping against a wooden stake as the county inspector pressed it into place. And I stood a few yards back with the morning sun cutting across the ground at a low angle, casting long shadows that now made the misalignment even more obvious if you knew where to look. And the inspector walked the length of the path slowly, clipboard in hand, stopping every few feet to compare notes against the report I had submitted. The same report Margaret had held with that brief flicker of doubt, and there was no argument this time, no polished explanation, just quiet confirmation written line by line as he documented the deviation, and by the time he reached the far end, the conclusion had already settled into the air like dust after a long day of work. The construction did not match the legally recognized boundary. The permit was issued based on incomplete survey data, and the project was now subject to immediate review and correction. And Margaret stood off to the side, arms folded, her posture still controlled, but stripped of that effortless confidence she carried before. And when the inspector handed her a copy of the notice, she took it without a word, her eyes scanning the page the same way she had scanned my report. But this time there was no angle defined, no language to lean on, just clear instructions and consequences tied to them. And the crew that had worked so steadily before was now quiet, tools resting against the ground, waiting for direction that did not come, because the direction had already been given by something far beyond a clipboard or a conversation. And I walked down the length of the path slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots in a way that felt different now, not like something foreign cutting through my land, but like evidence laid out in a straight line, every foot of it tied to the mistake they had built into it. And at the point where the path crossed the true boundary line, the one marked by the original iron pin, I stopped and looked back, seeing both lines at once in my mind, the one drawn in steel and time, and the one drawn in assumption and approval. And for a moment, everything was still, no engines, no voices, just the quiet weight of reality settling back into place. And Margaret finally spoke, asking what I wanted to happen next, her voice lower now, measured. And I told her it was not about what I wanted, it was about what the ground had always been, and what the records now proved, and that correction was not optional, it was required. And she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and turned to make a call that sounded very different from the one she had made before, shorter, sharper, carrying a tone that comes when control slips just enough to force a new direction. And as I stood there watching the scene shift from construction to correction, I realized something simple and final. They had trusted the map they created. I trusted the land that never changed. And in the end, the only one that mattered was the one that could not be moved.